Good evening, everyone. I think we'll make a start now. My name is Prasad. I'm the president of AFEC. We're a student society representing CB students here in the ANU, and we're happy to be working alongside ANU learning communities to present this panel discussion today. We are very fortunate to have a great set of panelists, and I'm very excited to gain some very valuable insight alongside everyone else here. But before we get to that, we just have a few matters for you to all be across. If I could just share my screen. So this is the order of the night. We're going to be starting off with, well, introductions and housekeeping, followed by presentations by Peter, Jayant, and Michael. And then followed by that will be a panel discussion where our panelists will be, I guess, responding to different questions from our moderator, Vaishnav. Then at the end, there will be an opportunity for everyone to ask questions. Just a few housekeeping matters. Please mute your microphones unless you have a question. If you do want to ask a question, you may ask them yourself at the end, or you could, if you're not comfortable doing that, you can ask anyone with an AFEC or LC in their name what your question is so that they could refer your question later. Please keep in mind this webinar will be recorded. So if you are uncomfortable in asking a question, then please just pass the question on to one of us. And you can, of course, change your screen name for additional privacy. If you do have any other concerns, just let us know, and we're quite happy to edit the recorded video at the end to take into account any concerns you have. And on top of that, we encourage everyone to be polite and respectful during the discussion, as is obvious. And that's everything from me, but I'd now like to pass on to our moderator, Vaishnav, to introduce our set of panelists.
Thank you, Prasad. Before we begin, I'd like to take some time out to welcome and introduce our three panelists for today who have taken time out of their schedules to partake in our event. So firstly, we have Dr. Jayant Menon. Jayant Menon is currently a visiting senior fellow at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore, following his early retirement from the Asian Development Bank, where he was lead economist in the Office of Chief Economist. He was also at the ADB Institute in Tokyo from 2005 to 2008. And he worked as an academic in Australia, spending more than a decade in the Center of Policy Studies at Monash University, Clayton. He has also worked at the University of Melbourne, Victoria University, and the American University in Washington, DC. He holds adjunct positions with the ANU of Nottingham, UK, and Ideas Malaysia. He served as a board director on the Cambodian Development Resource Institute and on the advisory board of the University of Nottingham, Malaysia campus. He has authored and edited 15 books, more than 40 chapters in books, and 80 articles in peer-reviewed journals. He holds a bachelor's degree with honors first class from the La Trobe University in Melbourne, as well as PhD degrees from the University of Melbourne. Secondly, we have Peter McCawley. Dr. Peter McCawley is an economist who's worked on the Indonesia and Asian economic issues for many years. He is currently a visiting fellow at the Indonesia Project at the ANU and holds a PhD in economics from ANU. He has written a number of books on numerous articles about the Indonesian economy and other aspects of Asian economic development. Prior, he has worked on Indonesian and Asian economic issues, and with his most recent work being with USAID project in Jakarta, and as advisor on the National Planning Board. Lastly, we have Michael Brennan. Michael Brennan is an experienced economist and management consultant based in Sydney, advising both the government and private sectors. Michael has recently led projects in the private and federal government clients on economic recovery strategies following the COVID-19 crisis, as well as policy responses that capture the opportunities presented in emerging and digital technologies. He has an extensive experience in economic analysis to form strategy and investment-making decisions across a range of sectors, including technology, transport, infrastructure, education, and health. He was previously an associate director at Deloitte Access Economics, and holds a bachelor's degree in economics first class from the University of Western Australia. With that being said, we will move on to the presentations by our speakers, starting with Dr. Jayant, followed by Dr. Peter McCawley, and finally ending with Michael Brennan. With that being said, Dr. Jayant, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Vishnav. And I'm very pleased to be here, and I thank the organizers for having me here today. I have 15 minutes, and I'm going to have to try and get through quite a few things in that short period of time. And I have a short PowerPoint to share with you. And as I try and bring that up, let me start by saying that the COVID-19 pandemic is first and foremost a health and human crisis. I think we sometimes lose sight of that reality. Oops, I'm sharing my something else with you right now. Right, so as I was saying, it's a health crisis, and we should always remind ourselves of this fact. We tend to put this aside as economists sometimes, but it is taking a lot of lives, is causing a lot of hardship. And now actually, we are finding that the response to the crisis by governments, particularly in the form of lockdowns, is causing as much, if not more harm than the virus itself. So it's no longer just a health crisis. It is now also becoming a humanitarian crisis and also an economic crisis. So I will focus on the economic and social impacts of this pandemic, and then finish off by saying a little bit about where we go from here with concerns about a second wave, what we should do or shouldn't do in moving forward. Right. So firstly, to start off with the economic impacts, I think we have a lot of estimates out there on how this is going to impact different economies. We are focusing now on the Asia-Pacific region. I will talk mostly about Asia and South and Southeast Asia. And, the preeminent source for these sorts of analysis and forecasts is the IMF. And they came out with a set of forecasts in April in their World Economic Outlook, which suggested that the world economy would contract by about 3% this year, right? Now, this was, quite alarming when it first came out. As you can see in that table, there's quite a bit of variation across countries in Asia, but quite a number of countries are going to be very badly affected, but with quite strong rebounds expected in 2021. But just a couple of weeks ago, less than a couple of weeks ago, the IMF found it necessary to revise their forecasts. And in the June revision of the World Economic Outlook, these are the last few columns, they suggested that the world would now contract by 5.4%, right? This was, a lot more than what they thought would happen earlier on, right? Now, generally speaking, they found that most countries would have deeper recessions, and the recovery next year would be a bit less subdued. And although they were still broadly talking about some kind of a reshaped recovery. And you can see that here in this next picture, where we have the first top line, the yellow line being what they think about China. So China, they find, will be probably the least affected of this grouping, which looks at the world divided into advanced economies, developing, emerging and developing, excluding China, and then of course China. So the yellow line, China, doesn't drop as much and rebounds a lot better, sharper than the rest. The next line is actually the world. If you go down from the right-hand side, I think that's sort of some kind of gray. The third line is for emerging and developing countries, the brown. And then finally, you have the advanced economies, the blue, which is the worst affected. They're the ones that drop most sharply, and they are also the ones that don't recover that quickly or that fully. So this is all quite pessimistic, but this is from the IMF. Now, regional institutions, like my former employer, the ADB, and also the ASEAN +3 Macroeconomic Research Office, AMRO, located here in Singapore, also sometimes, dubbed or hoped to be the Asian IMF, have come up with their own forecasts, and they're generally less pessimistic than the IMF. This is also generally true. They're seen as, the regional doctor. They can't be too pessimistic or too negative, but they also, point to quite significant slowdown in most countries, although not all countries falling into recession or falling into negative growth, I should say, this year, but bounce strongly next year. So the regional institutions are less pessimistic than the IMF, and they are also much more optimistic about the recovery next year. Right. So I think what all of this tells us is two things. Firstly, institutions that specialize in this also may get it wrong, will recognize that they've got it wrong, revise their numbers, and may still get it wrong. So there's a lot of uncertainty with how this virus is still evolving. And if you are not sure about how it's evolving, then it's very hard to measure its impacts. So that's the first thing to bear in mind. Second thing is that depending on who you look at, you can get a totally different picture of what might happen, right? So again, a feature of the huge amount of uncertainty with this forever evolving pandemic. So what both these factors, I think, tell us is that we should focus less on the numbers. The numbers are important, but we should look more closely at what is underlying these numbers and also assess the assessments, right? So look at the assumptions that are made, look at what they expect about the time frames, about what they assume about the evolution of the virus. All these things are critical if we're going to make sense of the numbers out there. But critically, I think it also tells us that we should focus perhaps more on the transmission mechanisms, right? So what is it that is driving these results rather than just the results themselves, right? So for instance, in Asia, we know that, or Southeast Asia, we know that global value chains are a critical part of the landscape. And they tie these economies together in a highly interdependent way. Global value chains are fabulous things. They produce great efficiencies. and they allow, the manufacture of a lot of sophisticated products at very low costs, but they're also very fragile things. So one break in the chain can lead to a complete collapse in the production line. And so Asia is particularly susceptible to this type of fragility because of the prevalence of supply chains or value chains. Another aspect about Asia is its high dependence on both trade and investment and its general openness. A lot of the successes of the developing countries of Asia have come through openness, but the other side of the coin is that they're also much more vulnerable to gyrations around the world. So a global pandemic such as this one will feed through quickly and strongly to these economies and affect them in significant ways because of the openness to trade and investment. Now, this is not to say that the response is to close your doors or raise barriers or retreat behind borders. That's the temptation in the short run when the crisis hits to raise protectionist barriers. But globalization didn't cause this pandemic, and it might have spread more quickly and deeply because of the interdependencies of caused by globalization. But it might help us recover from it in the end. It might produce the vaccine, the exchange of ideas and information that globalization allows will help us in our fight against the common enemy. So we should be careful not to rush to destroy institutions that have served us so well during these difficult times. And globalization is one of them. Right. Now, the pandemic has had a lot of social impacts. I want to move on to this next. And this is particularly important for Asia because Asia is home to most of the world's poor, especially where it all started in China, large numbers of poor still, and India, where it's spreading very quickly right now. And also in other parts of the developing world. So the poor are most susceptible to the virus because of the conditions in which they live, and also because of the relatively poor immune system due to malnutrition. But they're also very hardly hit by the lockdowns that have been introduced to deal with the effects of this spread. It's very hard for the poor for many of the poor to practice safe distancing. It's easy in theory to suggest that you should stay at home, you should socially distance, you should, wash your hands regularly. This is a bit difficult if you don't have a home, if you don't have running water in your home, and if you don't have a job, and if you don't have governments that can afford to provide you with support during times where you're not allowed to work. Now, if the poor have to scavenge for a living or beg for a living, they will do that. They will break the lockdown because the alternative is to starve. And so I think the WHO, in proposing these sensible measures, needs to also consider local conditions in poor countries. Lockdowns cannot work for prolonged periods in poor countries. In fact, they are not even sustainable in the rich countries, as we have seen, right? So these sorts of ground realities, I think, should be borne in mind. I would propose, now that we have had almost 6 months to learn from this experience, I would propose that measures should be more targeted, not just in terms of sectors, but also in terms of vulnerable groups. I think general containment measures probably not the best way forward, especially if you can't provide safety nets to keep people living while at home. In poor countries, it's not a choice between, saving lives or livelihoods. They're both one and the same thing in poor countries, right? You need your livelihood to continue living because the government cannot subsidize your living costs. They don't have that financial capability. Right, now let me finish off. I think I've gone over time already, but let me try and finish off by saying a bit about where we go from here. Currently, of course, we are facing the possibility of a second wave in the US, in many states. In Australia, we were talking about this earlier, about what's going on in Victoria. Now, in defining a second wave, we need to be clear about what goes into the calculation, right? When you reduce or ease on lockdown measures, you should expect a rise in infections, right? That is a given. The question is whether that rise warrants what one might describe as rampant community transmission, right? This is when the reinfection rate rises significantly above 1. So just a rise in infections alone is not a reason to rush and bring back all kinds of restrictions, but it needs to be one that is considered to be associated with community transmission in a potentially uncontrollable manner. This is not easy to do, but needs to be considered. There's also a lag between testing and results, reported infection rates. There are other lags, especially in poor countries, where testing is still catching up to what is considered to be a reasonable rate of coverage. So cases can rise because of increased testing rather than any new increase in community transmission. So all these factors need to be borne in mind in deciding whether we should bring back lockdowns, because we can't keep turning them on and off. And I think in going forward, these issues need to be considered carefully. But if there is a concern that there is rampant transmission, then restrictions should be brought back swiftly and in a very deliberate and specific way. And so, but we should not, jump the gun. And we know that, this will be difficult to do over and over again. Easing and clamping down too many times will result in a loss in credibility. So I think with that, let me stop there and thank you for your attention. And I look forward to the discussion to follow later on. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Jayant, for that very insightful presentation. Now we'd like to move on to Dr. Peter McCawley. If you'd like to leave share screen, and then Dr. Peter, you may take the floor.
Well, thank you. Good. Thank you. Jay has taken away his screen, so I can share my screen now.
Yeah, that's great.
And here is my screen. Is that visible to everybody? Can you see that?
Yeah, that's
good. Okay. Well, I'll be talking here about three comments. Keep them fairly brisk. One is about the impact of COVID-19 on Indonesia, just as a case study of the impact in the region, Asia. Second, I want to flag the absence of international cooperation in this crisis. This is an unusual global crisis when basically international cooperation has largely broken down. Not entirely, of course, but largely. And third, what does this mean for Asia, the region? There's a weakening of globalization. So what are the implications for developing countries? So those are my 3 points. Now, the first is the impact of COVID-19 crisis on Indonesia. Well, first, so far, it's not as serious as might have been feared. Many of us, of course, were very worried, particularly in Java. Java is a very highly densely populated small island, population of about 150 million people. It's a bit like Bangladesh, I suppose. And so there was very considerable concern about how the crisis might be contained in a place like Java. Well, so far, it has not been as serious as might have been feared. And by the way, this gives rise to really an interesting thought, not just about Indonesia, but elsewhere. And that is that across the world, we are seeing quite variable impacts of the crisis. There are obviously a lot of variables that affect how the virus is being transmitted. Population density is one, climate is another. Of course, general health conditions are a third, and the specific measures taken to prevent transmission are a fourth. They vary a lot between countries. So we don't really understand very well what the factors are affecting the virus. Why is it so bad in America? It's very bad in America, very bad. Of course, government policy has not been good, but even so. Anyway, to return to Indonesia, there are major problems. There are two aspects in Indonesia and elsewhere in other countries. There's the medical crisis and there's the economic aspect. Jay mentioned both of these. There are major problems in Indonesia in responding to the medical crisis. One is that government advice has not always been clear. Sometimes there have been contradictory messages. And second, there is an extreme lack of medical resources. Indonesia, as many other developing countries, are struggling badly with the shortage of medical resources, and I'll come to this. Second, also, economic policy has been adjusted in Indonesia, as it has in many other countries. There's been an expanded fiscal response. The Indonesian deficit has increased from about 3% to 6%. And as is the case in other countries, there's been expanded monetary policy as well through Bank Indonesia, the Reserve Bank. Now, just some figures on the impact on the resource constraints for Indonesia. And these cast, I think, you can think of this as, I'm comparing Australia and Indonesia, but you can consider these as proxies for OECD countries and developing countries. So it says Australia and Indonesia, but think of it as the rich world, the OECD world versus the developing world. GDP in Australia, and these are in US dollar billion figures, GDP in about a trillion, 1,500, top line 1,500, compared to Indonesia round about 1 trillion. And the ratio there is on the right-hand side. So the ratio is 1.5 to 1. That is Australia's 50% higher. 26 million compared to 270 million in Indonesia. So there's about 1/10 the population in Australia. Third line, just to give us some order of magnitude, total government expenditure, G is government expenditure. In Australia, it's about 350 billion, which is considerably larger than total government expenditure in Indonesia, around about 190 billion. So the ratio is 1.8 in Australia. But the two bottom figures are important. Expenditure on corona. In Australia, the government has announced a total program of round about $120 billion. These figures vary this, but it's 120. In Indonesia, making figure in per capita terms, that's about 4,600 US dollars, 4,600,000, 4,600 US dollars in Indonesia, compared to 185, less than 200 in Indonesia. So basically, Australia is spending $25 for every $1 per capita that Indonesia can spend. Now, this is just Australia and Indonesia, but this is the world. The entire world at present is divided into the rich world and the developing world. The resources available in rich countries are very, very great, and the resources available in developing countries are very, very scarce. So this constrains the responses in developing countries. Now, what about the crisis in Indonesia? What are the implications for Indonesia and other developing countries? Some economic implications are that Indonesia will need to borrow, but it's expensive for Indonesia to borrow overseas at present. So that's a problem. And here's some data. We'll come back to the screen, but here's some data on the international borrowing costs for Indonesia across the region. The top couple of lines, you can see that in the United States, United Kingdom, borrowing costs, international interest rates are quite low, round about the 0 level. Same is true in Germany. Now, it's a bit higher across most of Asia, except in Indonesia, it's quite high. Indonesia has to pay round about 6% to borrow in international markets. So I said earlier, and here we're back again to the previous screen, it will be expensive. So this means that Indonesia's international debt ratio will rise if it borrows, and it's going to be expensive. Later, the debt will have to be reduced. The options both for Indonesia and all other countries, if debt rises and you want to get debt down again, there are 4 ways across the world to get debt down. One is to renege on the debt, to refuse to pay it. Indonesia actually did this in 1975-76 in the Pertamina crisis. Second is to inflate your way out of the debt. Indonesia did this with Russian debt that it acquired in the 50s and 60s, and it inflated its way out of Russian debt. Third, countries can grow their way. The fourth two are the best, grow and pay the debt. Indonesia grew its way out of the debt during the Asian financial crisis, or it can pay the debt. But if it pays the debt, this has severe fiscal implications. They have to reduce government expenditure and increase taxes. So these are difficult options, and both Indonesia and other developing countries are going to have to consider them. So second point, my second main point is the absence of international cooperation in the crisis. The current crisis is marked across the world by a lack of internationalism. And one example, of course, the most famous example, I guess, is President Trump's announcement that the United States will withdraw from the WHO. This may or may not occur. The Congress might block it, but it does seem just absolutely astonishing that in the midst of a crisis like this, the United States talks about withdrawing from the preeminent international institution. There's also been a very low level of bilateral offers from the rich world, certainly from America, of course, but from Europe, United Kingdom, many other countries. There's been almost no bilateral offers of assistance. Now, I guess if we're going to try to say something good about this, we'd have to hope that perhaps it's just that donors are slow. Donors do take time to organize themselves. So perhaps there will be a stronger global response later. But, you know, we are going to need international support to provide vaccine across the developing world. A rough estimate is that we need something like 70% of people vaccinated. Now, to get 70% of people vaccinated in Africa and South Asia and in Southeast Asia is going to be a huge challenge. One line, I suppose, the rich world might say that they don't care, but this would then mean that the virus remains spread across the world. So we really need to tackle this huge challenge, and we're going to need international support. But for the present, at least, Indonesia in the current crisis, this is a new crisis, and it's the first time that Indonesia really needs to go it alone. Now, my final point is refers to a weakening of globalization and the implications for developing countries in Asia. As I see it, Asian regionalism needs to be expanded. This is so far, it's a 50-year project. Asian countries have been talking about expanding regionalism. Now, some people say that it's a pipe dream, that it's going nowhere, but I don't believe this is true. Regionalism is slowly growing. There are many institutions which are slowly gathering pace. Jay talked about a few of them. The Asian Development Bank has been quite important, but so have many others. And slowly, regionalism across Asia is going. Progress has been made, but more is needed. But certainly in this crisis, Asian countries are going to have to do this themselves. This is a challenge for the region. There's little support and sometimes even open opposition from outside the region. The rich nations, Europe and America, don't particularly like to see too much strong Asian regionalism. They feel threatened by this. Well, it's going to, the message to the OECD countries is that it is going to occur, and we need to work out how to do it. So the steps needed, there are 4 steps needed for Asian regionalism. A commitment to openness. Jay spoke about this, and I strongly agree with Jay on this. We really need, in an era when there's talk of rising protectionism, this would do great damage to the world economy and to the regional economy. This would be a huge setback in the movement towards rising living standards in Asia. So we need to commit to openness. We still need a stronger ASEAN. That will cost money, and it needs strong support from Indonesia because Indonesia is the largest country in ASEAN. We need to strengthen existing institutions. That's regional banks, such as the ADB, institutions, such as the institution that Jay is from, ISEAS. It's a good regional institution, think tanks, and so on. And finally, down the track, there has been talk for many years, vague talk, about an Asian type of OECD, which would be a sort of regional think tank to gather information and to make it easier to gather data. We still need, that's a dream perhaps, but we need to think about that. So those are my points. Those were my 3 points. Thank you very much. I'll leave it at that. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. McCawley, for that very insightful presentation. Now we will move on to our last speaker for the night, Michael Brennan, if you'd like to take over.
Thank you, and thanks Peter and Jay, and thanks everyone for joining. I will just share my screen as well. So can everybody see this? Great. So what I'm going to talk about this evening is about how we can capture the opportunities of the digital economy in helping to recover the sort of weakening economies in Australia and in the Asia Pacific region. So I'm going to focus really on sort of 3 questions. The first is, how is the crisis affecting Australia's economy? What are the opportunities presented by the digital economy to support recovery? And then finally, how can we leverage these opportunities in the Asia Pacific region and cooperate amongst ourselves in a way that sort of Peter was describing to help drive the kind of next wave of digital evolution and economic growth. So looking again at the IMF forecasting, the same numbers that Jay was presenting before, but from an Australian lens, you can see here that Australia is about to experience this year one of its deepest recessions certainly in the last 40 years and probably since the Great Depression. And so we're facing some pretty tough times ahead. And you can see there again, we're sort of bouncing back in 2021, but that's really up a really low base the prior year. So we're actually not even recovering to 2019 economic output until probably 2022 or 23. And you can also see here the kind of declining or weakening Australian economy, even leading up to COVID. Australia was in a position of, declining GDP per capita, and also sort of declining productivity or stagnating productivity in many sectors. So there was already a need for economic reform leading into COVID, and now we've had a very sharp shock, which will require economic reform coming out of this recession. If we look at some of the kind of unemployment impacts that occur following significant financial crises, we've kind of looked at some of the numbers here that are coming from Grattan, which basically look at how long it takes to recover from a crisis. And you can see here the unemployment rate in the Great Depression took about 10 years to recover And even in the 80s and 90s recession, it took a number of years to come back to pre-crisis levels. So unemployment is very, very sticky and takes a long time to recover. So if we're going to be in for some pain over the next couple of years, the RBA is sort of predicting that Australian unemployment will persist at about 7 or 8% for the next couple of years, and will even be above 6% by 2022. You'll notice here the GFC as well. We sort of managed to avoid a lot of the pain in the GFC due to the sort of economic stimulus, if you will, provided by China, which supported a mining boom. But I don't think we're going to be in the same position this time around. And so we think about what are the ways in which we can help recover the economy. One of the key ways is through the digital economy and digital technologies. We've seen in many ways the sort of underlying digital trends that have been occurring over the past few years have been accelerated by this sort of force to work online or shop online. And we can capture a lot of these opportunities through the kind of social and economic change that's been accelerated. So the World Economic Forum kind of refers to the digital economy as the fourth industrial revolution, as it's kind of the next wave of delivering sort of productivity and growth improvements, which they size about a $10 to $15 trillion global opportunity. And really that's delivered through two key channels. The first, that it delivers productivity improvements to existing industries, but it also grows new industries around sort of domestic digital industries who can export to markets, and even through the growth of digital exports as digital industries capture new markets. And so there's great value sort of offered by the digital sector through both lower prices for consumers, increased choice and access to services, and also through these productivity improvements and lower barriers to entry and trade. And this is sort of represented in the productivity data that we've seen, which has been produced by the OECD, and they look at firms who are very high digital intensity and compare them to sort of moderate and low. And you can see from 2009 to 16. The MFP, or multi-factor productivity improvement, over that period was 18% for highly digital firms, 5% for moderate, and -3% for low digital intensity. So the productivity gains from capturing digital innovation are huge through things like automation of repetitive processes, improved collaboration, and innovation. But Australia's performance in this sector is falling behind global peers. Up until the end of the 1990s, Australia was basically kind of middle of the pack when it comes to the contribution of the information communication technology sector. But now you can see it's right down the bottom of the list of kind of OECD countries as we've seen an increased reliance on mining, banking and property in Australia. You look at the kind of ASX and the market cap of those sectors, well, prior to COVID was much higher than the IT sector when you compare it to other countries. And this means that we're kind of losing out on a lot of the potential gains offered by the digital economy. You can see here what this chart looks at is kind of the economic impact of digital innovation from 2000 to 2018 from each of these four drivers here. And you can see that although it has some quite positive impact on the Australian economy, it's added 7.4% of our GDP over that period. It's actually much lower when you compare it to advanced economies, which have managed to contribute over 11% of their GDP from digital improvement over that time. A lot of that has got to do with the limited growth in domestic digital industries. So Australia's been done quite well in adopting technologies, particularly in the mining sector, who's at sort of the forefront of the technology frontier in internationally. But when we grow our own digital technologies or through digital exports, Australia doesn't perform quite as well. And so we've captured about 1/3 less from digital innovation as when compared to advanced economies. And so the next section we want to look at is how can Australia capture these opportunities that are presented by the digital economy? And how can we do that in the Asia Pacific region as well? And so what we've done is to look at, well, if Australia did manage to catch up to our global peers and get to about the middle of the pack in OECD countries, we could add about $50 billion in GDP to the economy. And that equates to about 1 to 2% of output. But if we could become a global leader, we could add 5% to the GDP on top of that, which equates to about another 7% of GDP, which would help to recover the economic output gap that's going to persist following COVID. So this is quite a stretch case for Australia, but you can see here the economic opportunity and value that's presented by digital innovation. And if we think about these technologies, it might not necessarily mean that Australia creates its own Silicon Valley, but a lot of these opportunities can be in areas which leverage our existing strengths. And what we've done here is to look at what are some of the biggest opportunities in the digital space that Australia can leverage, and what can help grow significant digital markets in the Asia Pacific region. And so we've called out 8 here, which represent about $155 billion in value over the next, or by 2028. The first one there is around precision healthcare and using data to personalize monitoring, treatment, and illness management. You can see a lot of the data used in hospitals now can often be quite unstructured, but there are significant opportunities to use data to help personalize and treat and even prevent illness. The second one there is around digital agriculture. So this could be things like the use of satellite technologies, drones, and sensors to improve the productivity of agricultural yields. Data-driven urban management. Australia's recently gone through a large construction boom, and using data and analytics to inform the management of buildings and urban systems can massively improve productivity. We've looked at cybersecurity is going to be such a huge issue as we go forward, as everyone's carrying around mobile phones, everything's becoming online, we're all speaking to each other through digital channels. The risk of cyber attacks is growing over time, and so the need for cybersecurity is going to become a massive need over the next decade and coming decades. Supply chain integrity, really understanding where our goods and services are coming from, and being able to track that through technologies like blockchain. Improving the way policy works and government works through data availability and linking our government data sets. You can see through the COVID crisis, the use of data has been so valuable to be able to target where infections are occurring and being able to form policy responses. Linking data and making a better use of data to inform policy is going to become so important. Final 2 here is around legal informatics, and that really refers to the increased sort of regulation that's occurring in the economy and using automation to improve those processes and become less manual intensive. And finally, some smart exploration and production. So these are just some of the opportunities that are available in the Asia Pacific region that we looked at based on analysis of sectors in Australia where we can leverage our strengths. We've seen recently an agreement between Australia and Singapore on the global on the digital economy agreement, which I think is just one example of how we can sort of work together in the Asia Pacific region to help grow some of these examples. And so I'll finish off here with just 6 broad-based policy approaches that can help capture these approaches. The first one there is around fostering trade and collaboration. We've seen in the UK a lot of sector deals which bring together sort of government, non-government organisations and the private sector to help spur innovation. The digital trade agreements that I just mentioned between Australia and Singapore can be really important, and increasing the flow of data and use of data across countries will be really important. Skilling the workforce of the future, making sure people are skilled in coding or just use of technology. And this can be things, this doesn't have to be necessarily graduates, or that's an important part, but it can also be cross-skilling or upskilling people who've been dislocated from jobs and are in unemployment. The third piece there is incentivizing innovation. So using kind of tax breaks or regulatory breaks to be able to incentivize firms to invest in innovation, boosting investment, incentivizing kind of early stage investment in tech startups, and limiting restrictions on tech startups can help to boost investment. Pragmatic regulation, so thinking about how we can make sure we can both keep people safe online and protect people's data privacy, but also not going too far so as to kind of minimize, so as to have an excessive regulatory burden, and making sure we've still got a dynamic economy which supports the investment in tech startups. And then finally, improving access to talent, which is, of course, quite problematic in the current environment, but being able to bring across skilled migrants who can help cross-train people in domestic industries is really important. Having a really kind of liquid workforce that can help, can sort of travel across regions is really important. And so just to summarize the 3 conclusions, we're currently in the largest economic dislocation of our lifetime. We're in for, we've seen across all of the countries that we've looked at today that we're in for quite a sharp rise in unemployment, and that's going to persist for a number of years. But there is a number of opportunities presented by the digital economy, which has been accelerated by the crisis. Australia is lagging behind in this sector, but this means there's a great opportunity to improve in this area and build quite a strong economy around digital innovation. And so I'll leave it there, and thank you everybody for joining. Much appreciated.
Right. Thank you, Michael, so much and all 3 of you for your presentations. We would now be moving on to a panel discussion. I have some questions prepared, but if any of the audience have questions, feel free to message, put it in the chat, or if you're comfortable enough, just unmute yourself and ask the question. But I guess I'll get the ball rolling. There was a lot of talk about trade and the notable absence of bilateral international cooperation. In what ways has the pandemic reconfigured existing trade agreements and trade blocs within Australia and the Asia Pacific region? I'll give it Peter, if you'd like to start us off.
Well, I guess I agree that these trade links are very important, and for the time being, of course, the COVID-19 crisis has made things more difficult. Many things have slowed up. I'd mention too that even when there are agreements in place, and Australia has just started a new agreement with Indonesia just in the last day or so, as a matter of fact. Ultimately, the trade agreements, a lot of them at least, not all of them, but a lot of them are very dependent on people-to-people relationships. The business community needs to talk to each other. It's pretty most of us who are academics perhaps don't appreciate this, don't understand this, but business people like to meet with business people. They like to talk it through. They like to develop relationships. They like to develop contacts. And if the movement of people has been cut off, which it has at present, this is a major barrier to certainly the development of new trading relationships. A related point, a second and rather different point I'd like to make is that while there's a lot of emphasis on trade, I think capital flows are very important as well. Money counts, investment counts. And we really need the entire Asian region looking ahead over the next 20 or 30 years needs not only openness in trade, but we do need much, much more investment, huge amounts of investment. Asia is still very short of infrastructure in all sectors. It's short of infrastructure. And when we look across Asia, we are in principle looking at a huge Asian boom. So let's talk about trade, but I'd also like to, perhaps on another occasion, not today, but I think we need to focus on capital flows as well. But Jay knows more about trade than I do. Jay has followed trade issues for many years. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Dan, would you like to?
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Vishnav. I agree with pretty much what Peter just said. Perhaps I can add by firstly noting that we have a tendency to sort of attribute everything that's happening right now in front of us to COVID. And I think we should resist that. I think Michael mentioned this also in his presentation. There were a number of things that were already happening before this pandemic came about early this year. And these trends were in place, and there was a lot going on the trade front. The main thing there, of course, is the US-China trade war that has huge impacts on the rest of the world, including countries like Australia that rely heavily on China for trade and investment, but are also engaged economically with the US and and strongly tied to the US in non-economic areas of security and so on. So, I think the point is often made that countries like Australia and other bystanders shouldn't take sides, and I agree with that, but sometimes they have little choice in the end. But I think they should resist it. So I think the trade war now has resurfaced in a new form, and this is because it's not really about trade at all. It's about global dominance, right? The US, as the prevailing hegemon, is threatened by the new kid in town, right? The pretender in the form of China. And so, trade is one way in which this, this is played out. It can be technology, it can be so many different things. And now it's apparently about China causing this pandemic and forcing it on the rest of the world. But if it wasn't the virus, would be something else yet again. So this US-China rivalry is here to stay and will continue. And the fallout will be felt, of course, mostly by China and the US, but also by others. And I think Australia will be one of those that will be affected. But everyone in the world will be affected. The world as a whole will lose out, but there will be winners and losers, right? ASEAN countries may stand to gain because of restructuring of the supply chains, this decoupling from China to some extent. Investments might move out of China to other countries that are competitive, like Malaysia, Vietnam, and so on. And so there will be a lot of restructuring taking place, but not just because of COVID, but because a number of other factors already been ongoing for quite a while. But let me finish off by echoing what Peter said. I think the real game is not so much trade but investment, and this is where most of the action lies. And there's been basically a dry up of foreign direct investment for now. There's a hold on it pretty much with this pandemic, and we don't know whether there'll be permanent changes in the volume. We know there'll be changes in the distribution of FDI, I just mentioned, but whether in fact, going back to this issue of whether globalization is going to be one of the victims of this whole pandemic, and if that's the case, countries will invest less abroad. There'll be less international flows of capital and trade, and the world will become more fragmented. Hopefully that won't happen, but that's a real risk, and that's where the cost will be very high into the long run. Let me stop there.
All right, thank you. Michael, would you have anything to add on? Or?
Yeah, I would say that the only thing to add to that is that it's not just goods and services that are important in trade, but it's also data flows are becoming an increasingly important and valuable component of trade. You've seen the kind of digital trade agreements between Australia and Singapore, which kind of limit the restrictions on the flows of data and where you can store data. I think those types of agreements are going to be increasingly important in the Asia Pacific region, and more of those types of agreements, which can see more of a free flow of data across regions, is going to be a real driver of economic growth.
All right, thank you for that. I believe we have a question from the audience.
Oh yeah, thanks, Vi. I'll just turn on my video.
Yep.
Hello. I just have a question. Hey. So all of you are kind of speaking about Australia and the Asia Pacific, and talking about the rivalry in China, and how there might be like winners and losers around the world from maybe the whole pandemic and just in general. I wanted to focus the question I'm asking on cybersecurity, and especially, there's been the recent cyber attacks and things like that. And I'm wondering, is Australia kind of punching above, and in terms of just the contestation between powers in the Asia Pacific region, and also can Australia do more in the innovation space to combat threats in the future that may arise from things like cyber attacks and stuff like that? So yeah.
Thank you, Ashish. Michael, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, I think cyber is going to be something that's going to become just exponentially important over time, as an increasing part of our economy is actually becoming digital.
Yeah.
Cybersecurity is just massive, and you can see massive growth in the number of cyber attacks. You can see as our economy and sort of currencies become increasingly digitized, cybersecurity just becomes so much more important. And I think that's something that Australia can take the lead on. That's something where it can become a growth industry for Australia. We can become experts in this field. Like we're doing pretty well. I think the cybersecurity in sort of our financial institutions is a strength we can leverage on, and it's something we can build on to become sort of a powerhouse in the region. So I think that's a really great point.
Thank you, Michael. Peter, Jayant, would you have anything to add to that?
Okay.
Do you have anything to add to the question?
I don't have anything to add.
Oh, well, let me just add one thing. I guess in this whole discussion about cybersecurity issues and cyber issues, One thing that does worry me greatly, I must say, is the division between the rich world and the developing world, the poor world. The world is dividing into two great segments. We've got the rich world, which is investing a lot in these sorts of things, and the developing world is still struggling with very basic issues. Do you know, in the whole of Indonesia, there's probably not one single tap that I would drink out of. Indonesia does not provide decent water for its population. And more than 30% of the kids in Indonesia are stunted. Can you believe that? 30% of the kids are stunted. So a lot of this cyber stuff is really more relevant for both the rich world and for the rich. In the developing world, the 30% of kids in Indonesia that are stunted, and the lack of clean water is a lack of investment in the public sector. They need more pipes. They need to have more facilities to collect clean water from the mountains, to store it and so on. Now, cyber issues will help us in these, but many of the issues in the developing world are very basic, and I'm seeing a very big division. I showed you some figures before. In Australia, we're spending more than $5,000 US per person in response to COVID, and in Indonesia, it's less than 200. The world is dividing into two, the rich world and the poor world, and COVID, if anything, is exacerbating this sharp division. Now, I think the developing world really has little choice. It's not going to get much help from the rich world, and a lot of the technology is of limited use. A lot of the technology is of use in rich countries and is of limited use if you want clean water and you want to tackle problems of stunted kids. So I think it's a major challenge. This is wonderful new technology, all of the new technology. The question is, how can we use it to help developing countries? And we're not doing a very good job because we don't care, actually. We just don't care. So developing countries, I believe, are largely on their own. I believe that. Developing countries are going to have to deal with these things on their own. Don't look to the rich world for support or help. They'll have to tackle these things alone. That's a very harsh message. It's a harsh message, but that, I'm afraid, is the way I see these things. Thank you.
Krishna, I might just add something to what Peter just said, if I may.
Yeah, no worries, please.
Very quickly, I agree with what Peter was saying. I think this is one of the issues that we need to be concerned about if you're interested in development, and it will exacerbate there's a so-called digital divide, right, between poor and rich countries, but also, of course, poor countries and within countries, right? Yeah, where, you know, people often talk about one of the silver linings of COVID is that it has hastened this progression towards a more digitized world, because we all now discovered Zoom, and we all sit in front of our computers and act as if we can work as productively as before. But not everyone works with a computer, and you know, the ones who can't are going to be even more marginalized at the end of all of this, and they will find themselves even poorer and less integrated into the formal economy. And this is particularly true in countries like Indonesia and other countries with large proportions of the poor. But as Peter said, this type of technology can be used to address many of these inequities if we wanted to, right? If there was motivation and interest, there isn't enough. And that's a separate debate, why there isn't enough. We could talk about that in a separate session maybe. But the new technologies can be used to reduce inequalities. You can use, you can leapfrog in many areas if we want. You can bring populations in Cambodia and remote areas through, solar parks if we wanted to. Unfortunately, development agencies can provide, funding for small-scale projects that deal with that. but that has to be supplemented by a national focus in many countries that have limited resources. So we can use new technologies to address the unintended consequences of digitization, which is increasing in inequality, but we don't seem to be doing that, and we should probably try and do a bit more in the future.
All right, thank you so much for that, Jayant. I believe we have a question from the audience member, Nick. If you'd like to pitch your question now, you're more than welcome to.
Yeah, thank you. And many thanks for the panel discussion. It's been really interesting. I have a question on China and Southeast Asian economic engagement. We could argue to what degree COVID has played a role in this, although there's probably several drivers at play. We've seen calls for a Western decoupling from China, or at least moving elements of various supply chains out of China. Do you expect to see Southeast Asian countries to follow that trajectory, or conversely, would you expect to see Southeast Asian countries engage more with Chinese projects, such as Belt and Road Initiative, to facilitate their economic recovery?
Thank you for your question, Nick. I think, Jayant, would you like to start us off with this?
All right, let me start. I'm sure the others have views on this. I think, yes, I agree with the sentiment you expressed. There is some decoupling taking place, and I think I mentioned the restructuring of supply chains earlier as one illustration of that process. In the broader deglobalization taking place as well, to some extent. That I think when all these things are settled, the dust settles, we'll find some decoupling, some deglobalization, not just from China, but from the US as well, right? These two countries will be less engaged, I think. Your question, I think, relates not so much to the West, but to Southeast Asia. Now, China has no closer natural ally than Southeast Asia, but it doesn't seem to realize that. I think the way in which it has behaved in relation to its neighbors could be significantly improved. This goes beyond the water dispute. I forget what the PC term is. It's not South China Sea, but we all know what I'm talking about. And it's quite clear that China is ignoring international decisions and deliberations. And even if it wasn't, China is too big to want to even appear like bullying its smaller neighbors, right? China should be magnanimous, I think. It can afford to be. And it will pay off in terms of a bigger dividend if it was less of an apparent bully in this region. And this has escalated in the recent past. And I think China risks, a very broad-based fallout with many parts of the world if it continues this way. It doesn't need to do this, as I said. It will probably be able to meander through this and still maintain its role because of the interdependence, but it could actually grow its relationships a lot more by giving in some of these areas when it doesn't seem to be doing so.
Thank you for that insight. Peter, would you like to, do you have anything else that you'd like to add in?
Yes, well, the rise of China is obviously one of the great events that is going on at present. I'd like to just add that in addition to the rise of China, the rest of Asia is rising as well. It's not as fast as China, but India is growing. It's paused at present. Of course, everything is a bit uncertain with COVID, but I expect that both India and Southeast Asia will continue to grow and will continue to grow for 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 decades. The opportunities for growth and expansion are still very great. So One challenge, I think, is for the rich world to get used to the idea. The rich world finds it hard that the third world is growing. Now, this was always going to happen once development got going. And there will be expansions in Latin America and Africa as well. But let's just focus on Southeast Asia for a moment. It's interesting that in the global discussion is seeing a clash between China on one hand, America in particular, and perhaps Europe is trying to decide what to do as well. Well, there is an important player in all of this, as Jay has pointed out, and that's Southeast Asia. 600 million people. 600 million people and 10 countries in ASEAN, a group that is not insignificant. Now, very broadly speaking, what I see, and Jay is sitting there in Singapore, so he can see it more clearly than me, but what I see is something rather interesting in Southeast Asia, and that Southeast Asia is being very careful about being caught in this clash between China and America and other countries. Southeast Asia understands that at the end of the day, Southeast Asia is going to have to live with the dragon. The challenge is not to crush China or to push China back into a hole, because that's not going to happen. The question is how to live with a power that has grown greatly in the last 40 years and will probably continue to grow as Southeast Asia and India is growing. So the region is growing, and different parts of the region are going to have to spend the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years learning to live with each other. Now, the single most important challenge across the region, there's a single most important challenge, and that is to avoid conflict. We know that the worst thing in the world for development is conflict. Vietnam was held back for 30 years or more by conflict. Other countries have been held back by conflict. This latest clash between India and China is not helpful. We hope, I think those of us who have goodwill towards Asia and believe that development across Asia is terribly important. In fact, it is one of the great tasks of the world to lift living standards across Asia. We hope that the most important thing is that there be peace. So somehow we need to learn to live with this dragon. My final point on this is that I agree that Jay's made some important points. It would be good if the dragon was a little bit more careful, but I've got limited experience with dragons, but my experience with dragons is that they're often a bit clumsy. They're hard to deal with, dragons. We learnt that in The Lord of the Rings, in The Hobbit. Those dragons there were hard to deal with, and the Chinese dragon will probably, in a way, China needs to learn how to deal with the world. And a problem that China has is that in leading to deal with the rest of the world, it has also huge internal problems. I think Xi Jinping probably spends 95% of his day worrying about domestic problems. So how are we going to live with the dragon? That's a big challenge. I hope we can do it and keep the peace. Those are my comments.
All right. Thank you once again for that. Michael, do you have anything to add?
Oh, just a very short comment, really. But I think Australia, we've historically ties to the United States as a trade partner, but now China is growing to very much be our sort of number one partner, and we're increasingly becoming reliant on them. And I think sort of diversifying our trade partners within the Asia Pacific region is going to be really important to sort of manage those tensions and manage those sort of growing divide between the US and China, which both are kind of going in a lot of different directions. I think this increased cooperation in the Asia Pacific region is going to be really important for sort of managing those tensions.
No, precisely. Thank you so much for that, for your insight on the question. I think we have another floor question. If you'd like to ask your question now.
Yep, thank you. Just sort of prefacing this a bit, as Nick said, we're trying to decouple from China, obviously, and Australia, for that reason, has to in the context of even protecting national security, somewhat upscale production in sectors such as perhaps manufacturing. But isn't there a worry that with a focus on digital technology and services development, it will create a sort of Dutch disease phenomenon that sort of even just compounds the problem that we have currently?
Yeah, sorry. Peter, would you like to answer that?
Yes, I know there's this debate going on in Australia now about trying to upscale manufacturing. I guess I'm skeptical about it. I'm not sure this is, for an economist like myself, there's an old-fashioned issue here, and that's, are we good at it? What are we good at? Comparative advantage. There is a line of thought that challenges the comparative advantage idea. I understand that, but at the end of the day, I believe it's wrong. You know, if you undermine comparative advantage, you hold back growth, you hold back the strength of the economy, and a lot of international strength comes from the strength of your economy. So in the long run, you shoot yourself in the foot if you don't focus on things that are effective. Now, what can Australia offer Asia? Michael has talked about the importance of digital issues, and that's clearly important. And looking past manufacturing, so is services. There's going to be a huge demand for services in Asia in the next 50 years, in all areas. Services has been a rapidly growing sector in Asia for 20 years or more, often from a low base, but there's still very great room for expansion of many, many types of services. Australia is a service-driven economy. Australia has skills in services, and I think Australia should be learning how to reach out more to provide services. I'm not sure that Australia can do it, by the way. We in Australia need to adjust ourselves, and if we can't adjust ourselves, then Asia will go ahead and get its services from elsewhere. But I would be looking really to promote services in Australia. Rather, I'm not opposed to manufacturing, but it's an old-fashioned idea. This is looking back 30 years or more. We need to look to the future, and I think the future is in services, including in the technological issues that Michael spoke about. On the technological issue, I'd really be interested in how we can use the technology to really help the mass of people in Asia, many of whom still remain poor. That's a major concern for me. But services, the short word is less, don't worry too much about manufacturing, look to services. That would be my message. It's a bit controversial, but there you are. Over to you.
Thank you for that. Michael, would you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would say when we think about the digital economy, I wouldn't think of it as a specific sector as Australia needs to develop its own Facebook or its own Google, but kind of think about it across all sectors in the economy and sort of thinking about it in terms of leveraging our existing strengths. So we might become, you know, we're currently one of the world leaders in mining technology in terms of you know, automation of vehicles and using robotics to as part of our mining processes. And I think we need to just kind of think about that across the spectrum of Australia's economy, whether that can be in agriculture or in healthcare or in government or in our finance or even in cybersecurity, as we talked about previously. So I don't think it's about shifting our existing sectors and creating, you know, something new. I think it's about leveraging our existing competitive strengths in agriculture, in construction, in financial services, and using that as kind of a platform to build on those, to develop new digital technologies and markets in that sort of comparative advantage.
Right. Thank you for that. Jayant, do you have any remarks on that question, or
yeah, maybe just very quickly. I agree with what's been said about how, you know, high value-added services is an area that where there's future for good jobs. It's already happening in education, health, and so on. And also, as Michael said, I mean, I think there's a difference here between intra-industry specialization and inter-industry specialization. I don't think we need to start building aeroplanes or things like that, which have been tried elsewhere and fail miserably. Coming back to this idea about respecting comparative advantage, but there can be intra-industry diversification, and that involves, for instance, like in agriculture. I mean, Australia is the most efficient. Australia and New Zealand have the most efficient agricultural sectors, and there's a lot of potential for high value added within agriculture, which, unlike say mining, has no climate change issue hanging over it, like with coal and so on. But in terms of say new forms of weather resistant crops, there's for technology to be used in improving the way in which agriculture is done and what to grow and how to produce, market it, etc. A lot of room there as well. So we don't need to move into new high-tech industries where we don't have comparative advantage, but within existing sectors that we do have a comparative advantage in, there's a lot more that can be done, which will deliver good jobs at good wages. And that's the kind of diversification I think we should be looking at.
All right, thank you so much. We've just got one final question before we wrap things up. It was in the comments. We just want your comments on the viability of restructuring existing investments within the economy towards greater internal capacity building or towards recovery efforts.
Right, okay, so maybe I'll get started just to get things going. I think right now we talked about the stimulus packages earlier on. Of course, the stimulus packages are designed mainly, as a holding measure, right? They're not designed. I mean, it's a misnomer to call them stimulus packages because you cannot stimulate an economy that's largely shut down, right? I know Australia has opened up quite a bit, although Victoria now might be clamping down again. The way to reinvigorate the economy is to return to restrictions are no longer required and you have the virus under control. That's where I think we should be heading towards, and that's when the stimulus measures will limit economic downturn. But we hear a lot about building back better and so on. I don't think this COVID will change everything when we finally get over it. It can change and should change a few things. I think we can use this as an opportunity to improve on a lot of things, but not everything. I don't think we should expect too much to change. Look at every other crisis and pandemic. A few years after it's happened, we can't even remember when it was or what it did. We do have short memories, but there is an opportunity to try and, build back better. But I don't think we should expect too much.
Thank you for that. Michael, would you have anything to add to the question?
Yeah, I would say, yeah, it's a really interesting question. And I think we've seen in some of the stimulus measures so far that they've really been used to kind of keep people's livelihoods going throughout the crisis, while we've seen these kind of government imposed restrictions. And we've seen some of the largest stimulus measures ever delivered. Like I think the Australian stimulus package was around 10% of GDP. But I think going forward, we can't be afraid to do more around of stimulus measures that help us to stimulate the economy back towards growth, because we're going to see, even after we come out of this crisis, when a number of the stimulus measures kind of fall off a potential cliff when they change in September, that we probably need another round of measures that can help to boost investment and create jobs and really get us back towards the growth that we'd seen in the early parts of the 2000s.
Right. Thank you so much for that, for all your presentations and thank you for being here. We really did learn a lot from you. With that being said, I think it has been time to close this discussion. Thank you for our audience for coming in and for the questions you guys asked. It was really engaging, and thank you once again to our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vishnav, and thanks to your audience for listening.
Thanks, Vishnav. Really appreciate it.
Thank you once again for your presentation.
Great. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thanks, Prasad. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, it was a pleasure to meet all of you, and thank you so much for taking your time out to do this. Yeah, it was definitely like a really insightful discussion, I think, for a lot of us.
That's true.
Okay. All right. Well, I will, if you like, we can show you the recorded audio. The recorded video before we post it anywhere, such as YouTube or Facebook. And if you have any concerns about that, then just feel free to let us know.